Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We would discuss today the application of international economic sanctions in terms of day-to-day life of every individual, and more specifically, how they could affect the cross-border transfers of personal items like smartphones, laptops, personal motor vehicles, or cash when crossing EU-Russia border, whether directly or through third-party jurisdictions, to demonstrate that the international economic sanctions is not just a matter of news or geopolitical discussion, but it's also something which may be relevant for every individual, and both in the European Union and in Russia. And more specifically, we would look into the following points. We would look into the restrictions which apply to the transfer of personal goods from European Union to Russia. We would then consider the restrictions which apply to the opposite situation, the transfer of personal goods from Russia into the European Union. We would look specifically into the questions which restrict carrying cash, and then we'll put this into the context of a few practical advice. So the main restriction which applies to the transfer of goods from the European Union to Russia is found in Article 3H of Regulation 833, which is commonly known as the prohibition to export, sell or transfer so-called luxury goods to Russia. Important point to note is that although the relevant restriction refers to luxury goods, in essence, any category of listed goods which exceeds the indicated price threshold will be deemed to be a luxury good. The general price threshold is set at 300 euros. And then there are individual price thresholds which apply to certain categories of goods. For example, for domestic appliances, the price threshold is set at 750 euros. For musical instruments at 1,500 euros. Originally, a 50,000 euros threshold applied to the sale or export of motor cars to Russia. Over time, it was believed that this threshold was prone to abuse, and it was replaced by a restriction which is now based on the volume of the relevant engines. Important point to note with respect to the restriction is that, first of all, it covers a wide variety of goods, of consumer goods, which would not be typically considered to belong to luxury goods. So the relevant list is long, and to the extent you carry anything of value to Russia, you better consult this list before traveling. Because in addition to the goods which might be considered as luxury goods, like jewelry, for example, or watches, there are also all types of clothes, all types of articles for sports, perfumes, cosmetics, alcohol, and other products, which would not be commonly deemed to be luxury goods as such. The second point to consider is that there is no generally exception for personal use, non-commercial transfer of goods across the border. Whilst the overall purpose of the regulation was clearly to disrupt the trade in these goods between the European Union and Russia, the actual language in the regulation in addition to sale and export, also refers to the transfer. And transfer as such is prohibited even if unrelated to sale or export transaction. So transfer of these goods across the border, even for the purpose of subsequent retransfer of the same goods back to the European Union, will be subject to restriction. And when crossing the border, these goods can be seized. The only exception provided in the regulation relates to very specific positions, which mainly cover the transfer of jewelry for personal, non-commercial use. All other items, for example, musical instruments, if you are a professional musician, and if you're traveling to Russia, and if your musical instrument exceeds 1,500 euros, which would be the case for almost any professional musical instrument, the musical instrument may be seized at the border, even if the relevant person has no intention whatsoever to sell this instrument in Russia or to a person in Russia. The relevant regulation with respect to the transfers of goods from Russia to the European Union are mainly found in Article 3I, which again, primary purpose is very different from the subject of this presentation. The primary purpose of this article is actually to reduce Russian exports of certain, mainly commodities or items produced from those commodities to the European Union or to other parts of the world with a view to reduce Russian income resulting from these categories of exports. And indeed, if we review the relevant annex, which lists the articles to which the prohibition applies, this would be mainly commodities like coal, wood, cement, asphalt, helium, certain kinds of fertilizing materials, etc., not the categories of goods which a individual may carry in his luggage when on personal travel. Nevertheless, the relevant categories of goods are framed very broadly, and they include indeed certain categories which very well can be used by an individual for his personal purposes, like, for example, hygiene items. The issue was very relevant with respect to personal motor vehicles, which are also covered by the article as a category of goods which export is prohibited from Russia to the European Union. There is no price restriction here, so all type of personal vehicles would be subject to the restriction. And the question arose whether, to the extent, for example, a person living in a neighboring region is coming to the European Union for a temporary visit, or for example, his family, or for example, for business purposes, with the view to go back to Russia. So there is no question that the relevant car would be sold or somehow exported to the European Union. Well, this will be called by prohibition, and indeed many issues arose at the borders when the relevant cars were stopped or even seized. Important point to note is that with respect to the application of this restriction, there is a general exemption for personal use goods, but the exemption does not automatically apply, but merely allows the national competent authorities to not apply the restriction to such kind of personal items. So there is always a risk the relevant authorities will apply the restriction and the relevant goods will not be allowed to enter the European Union. With respect to the motor vehicles, the matter is specifically addressed in a way that, first of all, an authorization is required, even for the personal use transfer of a motor vehicle from Russia to the European Union. And second, this authorization can be granted only to an EU citizen or to a family member of an EU citizen. We would now look into specific restrictions which apply to cash, where the relevant prohibition is that the transfer of banknotes denominated in euros or in other currencies of the European Union, for example, the currencies of those countries who have not exceeded to euro, is not permitted if the relevant transfer is to Russia or to any legal person in Russia. The first point to note is that there is no de minimis exemption. So in principle, any amount of transfer, regardless of how small it is subject to restriction. Given the current disruption of processing the transfers through the bank accounts, when in essence the relevant services are offered by very few Western banks which still maintain their subsidiaries in Russia and which offer this type of services, it is quite clear that the exemption would have very significant effect on the ability of, for example, EU citizens to travel to Russia. With this in mind, the exemption allows for the transfer of that cash, which is necessary for personal use. Nevertheless, the relevant exemption was given very restricted interpretation by the Court of Justice, which in essence interpreted the exemption as applying only to that cash which is necessary to cover travel-related expenses only. Previously, the view was taken that personal use needs to be distinguished from commercial or investment use. So to the extent the relevant cash would not be applied for business-related purposes of an individual or for investment purposes, for example, to buy property in Russia, to put the relevant amount in a deposit, to buy some securities. So to the extent it's used really for personal use, as the language suggests, that shall be permitted. This was not the interpretation given by the Court of Justice, which substantially restricted this derogation. So from these background laws, the following practicalities arise. The first point to note is that the list of goods which transfer to Russia is prohibited, is extremely long. It may apply to goods which one would not consider to be luxury goods, as the title of this restriction suggests. And accordingly, to the extent you transfer with you, even for private use, non-commercial purposes, and even with the intention to bring the relevant good back on your return to the European Union, so to the extent any of your goods exceeds 300 euros in value, you shall carefully consider the relevant list of restrictions. You shall consider where your goods fall, because other than for jewelry, these even temporary, non-commercial transfers for personal needs are prohibited. And accordingly, you can run the risk of the relevant goods being seized at the border. And furthermore, criminal proceedings or other proceedings been started against for the breach of the EU sanctions regulations. It's important to note that the relevant restrictions covers third country over flights. There are no direct flights currently between European Union and Russia, so the typical travel and destinations will require a stop in a third-party jurisdictions. And to the extent you fly through the third-party jurisdictions, this does not change the applicability of the restriction. You can very well be inquired as to your final destination. And if your final destination is in Russia, the restriction will apply. Another point to note is that non-EU origin of the goods does not disapply the restriction. So to the extent you have, for example, Japanese electronic appliances, the restriction would still apply. The cash transfers from European Union to Russia remain committed, but the purpose of those transfers shall be to cover the travel and expenses. And you might be required to prove, well, crossing the border, that you would be incurring those travel and expenses, for example, by staying at the hotel rather than staying at, the place of your relatives. It seems to be prohibited, given the interpretation of the term given by the Court of Justice, to bring any cash for other personal, non-commercial use, for example, to support your relatives living in Russia, to, for example, visit a doctor in Russia and cover the medical expenses you can incur with respect to this visit, or, for example, to bring back your savings in the European Union, which some people may need to do given that their employment, for example, has been terminated. So it's an important point to note, given that the relevant amounts can very well represent the savings of a substantial part of your life. For the inbound transfers, so for those people who travel from Russia to the European Union, generally the restrictions should not apply because the relevant categories of goods mainly relate to commodities and some finished items produced from the commodities, which typically are not the items which a person would carry with him while on personal travel. But nevertheless, as we've discussed, there are some items which can fall within the relevant restrictions, the most important of which are personal motor cars, where the current regime allows their transfer even for personal non-commercial purposes, and even for the purpose of subsequent retransfer back to Russia, only subject to a prior authorization, and only on condition that the relevant person is an EU citizen or a family member of the EU citizen. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you through my further presentations. Thank you very much for watching.